In 2019, I suffered my final serious injury and by far the most painful of my career. I've always been a risk taker, and throughout my gymnastics journey, I've broke, fractured and tore my body apart in the pursuit of Olympic glory. And this is my story. When I was a little kid, I was always getting into accidents. I was always known as the accident-prone kid, and I would trip over everywhere, fall over, and I think it's because I was always a big risk taker. And literally from the get-go, I remember going with my family to Oldham Park, and we're running through like the trees on the side of the path. And my cousin and I think her friend had ran over this tree branch, and I was too little, so I went to stand on the top of it, and it snapped in half, and all of a sudden there was a bee's nest inside of it, and I was stood there, head over my hands like this, a swarm of bees just stinging me, and my mum and my auntie had to run in, and they kind of pulled me out, and they drove me off to A&E, to hospital, and they were just pulling the bees out of my hair and like throwing them out the window in the car. And that was kind of the story of my life when I was a kid. I was always kind of getting into accidents and doing things I probably shouldn't have been. I can remember jumping in a boiling hot bath when I was really little, and that kind of followed me into gymnastics. And when I started gymnastics in the early years when I was very young, before I started doing the most difficult skills, I didn't really pick up too many injuries. I can't remember too many. I can remember one time getting injured outside of the gym. I'd gone to White Post Farm with my family, which is like a play area. I think I was showing off to a girl trying to do a backflip on one of the small little trampolines, and I landed on like a sandbag on my bum, and I broke my coccyx. I think that was the first bone that I broke, my tailbone. And at school, I had to sit on a pillow for about 3 months at school. But yeah, early on, there weren't too many injuries. I think the first serious injury I had in gymnastics was my cheekbone. So I was about 8 years old, and the coach at the time, who later became one of the GB national coaches, had asked me to do a triple front somersault off a trampoline. Now, I was only about 8 years old, so I was really young to be trying a skill like that. And for some reason, he'd asked me to do it on a crash mat. So I did the first one, and it was really good. It was like perfect. And I got really excited. I thought, right, I'm going to do this one more time. And kind of at this point, a lot of the older lads from the gym had come to look, because there was this 8-year-old kid doing a triple front off a trampoline on a crash mat, which was pretty crazy. And in gymnastics, there's a thing called a cowboy. So when you do somersaults, multiple somersaults in a row, you have to pull your legs to the side in case you land and your head goes kind of down towards your knees, and it will go between your legs rather than hitting your knees. And, you know, I just didn't have the experience to do that. I was only 8 years old, and I've done this triple front. It wasn't quite as good. It was a bit lower, and my head has just smacked my kneecap full pelt. I've hit my cheekbone, and it's swollen up really fast. And my dad came, somebody called my dad, and this became like a bit of a theme throughout my career that, you know, I'd get injured in the gym, my mum and dad would get a call, and they'd know if they were getting called in the middle of a session, it was probably because Sam's hurt himself and we've got to take him to A&E. So my dad comes and picks me up, and my face is like this big at this point, and the coach is saying, it's going to be fine, just put some ice on it. And my dad kind of drove me home, and I could kind of see the panic on his face, and he pulled up, and I'll never forget, like, we've got a big window in my living room, and my mum was stood at the window, and she screamed because you couldn't see my eye. My face was like this. And she was like, are you joking? We're not just putting some ice on it. We've got to take him to the hospital. So they took me to the hospital, and it turned out that I'd fractured my cheekbone. And they were basically saying that this was quite a serious injury. We're going to have to monitor Sam's recovery, but it looks like he's going to have laser surgery and a metal plate put in his face. And that was pretty serious, that was. I mean, that shook me up. And I actually still have the hole in my face today, so I can still poke a hole in my cheekbone. And the coolest thing about that injury when I was a kid was that, and it definitely didn't deter me from trying dangerous things in the gym, but the coolest thing was when I was at school, because I'd hit my face so hard, I looked like the Elephant Man, and all the white part of my eye was like bloodshot red for like 3 months, but like a deep dark red. So I'd just run around scaring all the girls at school, so I thought it was hilarious. But that was my first injury, I think, my first big injury from gymnastics. And it was because I took risks. You know, I was the kid in the gym that, I don't know whether I was brave or courageous, or I was too scared to say no when somebody asked me to try something, but I was always be the one kid in the group that would try it first. And it's funny that, because I'm not very good at just going for something. As I got older and as I went throughout my gymnastics career, I kind of trial and errored things. So I'd try something slightly differently, but I wouldn't really just go for it. And I actually became I admired the kids that would really just give something a go when they've never even tried it before. I had to watch it on tape. I'd watch someone else doing it. I'd really try and imagine it and visualize it and kind of like take baby steps towards trying a new skill. But yeah, I'd be the kid in the group that everyone kind of point at me, and I'd just be too scared to say no, so I'd go and give it a go. And I think the next injury that I really like picked up was when I was about 11 years old, and it's a funny story because it was a real breakdown in communication with me and Sergey, and it probably says a lot about what I was like when I was 11 years old and when I was a kid and around that age. I had been on the high bar, and I just got to the point where I was starting to get a little bit braver on the high bar, and high bar was turning into an event, one of the apparatus that I was getting quite good at. And I'd said to Sergey, I really want to try a Markelov with a full turn. And like I was really little to be doing that skill, because a Markelov on high bar, which was quite often the first skill I would do in my routine, it was the first skill in my last routine that I did, you need quite a lot of strength for it. It's not so much about technique, it's more about power and understanding the pull on the bar. And so I was so little when I was 11, I didn't weigh anything, so trying to do a Markelov was like really hard. And I just kind of learned it, and I was getting over the bar, and I said to Sergey, I'd like to try it with a full turn. And Sergey thought I meant when I was older, because in his mind, he couldn't even fathom that I would try and do this skill because I was so little. And so he said, yes, that's a brilliant idea, Sam. So I get up on the bar and no pad, strap myself in, wind up for this Markelov, get nowhere near over the bar, try and do a full twist, and I smashed my leg on the bar, and I broke my tibia by hitting my leg on the bar, which is incredible because there was not much height. I wasn't coming from much of a distance. That's how hard I must have whacked my leg. And Sergey kind of picked me up and put me on the mat. We got my leg up, we got some ice around. I'll never forget it because one of the lad's parents was being pretty nosy, and he was stood at the doorway, and he came over and he went, "Oh, you'll be laughing about that in the morning." I can remember thinking, I'm in so much pain. I'm like in agony here. Like, I don't need you this guy saying this. But again, my dad gets the phone call, takes me to the hospital. They tell me that I broke my leg, and I get a cast for the very first time. I can remember asking for a red cast because red was my favourite colour, like Man United. I had all my friends at school and like friends at the gym writing on my cast, and it was probably my first real experience where I can remember, because I was 11 now, of doing a rehab and doing a bit of recovery. And I mean, even that was crazy. I remember Sergey getting me on the high bar with my cast on. I was swinging around the bar in my cast. A couple of weeks afterwards, I was doing trampoline and fast trap with my cast on, just doing somersaults. I even started doing double somersaults and stuff. So, I just wanted to get back to doing gymnastics as quickly as possible. So I never really fully recovered from those injuries. And back in those days, especially when I was young and I was a teenager, we didn't have a medical team. There would be a doctor at British Gymnastics that would go away and would work with the senior teams, but not the junior camps. We wouldn't have a physio or anything like that. So you kind of just strap yourself back up, and if you get blisters, your coach would sort your hands out. There was no physio taking care of that. So there was no rehab. It was literally a case of you take the cast off and you just crack on and get straight back to it. Which is great. Like, looking back now, it was brilliant. Like, you didn't have a choice. You just started doing gymnastics again. And I'm sure that we all picked up a lot of knock-on injuries because of that, because we didn't do any rehab. We didn't build ourselves up kind of physically again before we started doing gymnastic skills. But we didn't know any different. And over the next few years, I continued, as I grew into my teenage years, to kind of get used to competing with injuries. And I became the guy that was always injured. I was always in a cast. Once a year I'd be on crutches, or in a cast, or I'd be injured. And I struggled with a lot of growing pains at that age. When you're a teenager and you're doing gymnastics, back then, the equipment was very different to what it is now. We didn't really have sprung floors. They were very hard. They were really tough, and it was really difficult to do high volume of training, particularly on the floor. And I really struggled with my knees. So a lot of gymnasts back then would get Osgood slatters, which is like growing pains in your knees, or they'd get severs in the heel, or they'd get shin splints, and they'd really struggle when they were growing, because when you're a teenager and your growth plates are growing and doing their thing, and they're at work and you're getting taller, everything, it becomes more difficult, and you get lots of pains in your joints. So a lot of gymnasts will struggle with wrist pain or elbow pain, but for me it was always my knees. I really struggled with my knees, to the point that when I was at secondary school, I used to sit there on like the lab seats because they're quite high, aren't they? And you'd sit there and my legs would dangle, and by the time the lesson had finished and the bell had ring for lunch, I'd have to stretch my knee out so slowly I'd like hobble to the lunch dinner queue to try and get in the line to get food early, and I just really struggled for years with that. So that was always a constant battle in my teenage years, those growing pains in my knees. But I started to pick up a lot of injuries, and I would compete on them, and I think that was the crazy thing looking back. I got so used to competing injured. You know, I remember one time hurting my knee, and I'd been at Lilleshall and again taking risks. I was trying to do release and catches, and I think Sergey had asked me to see if the group who could do the most release and catches in one go. So I tried to do these 5 release and catches, and I did a catch over the half turn like that, and I pung at the bottom, hit the foam pit, my knee stayed where it was, my body kept moving, and I basically tore the ligament on the inside of my knee, and we had a competition at the end of that week. So I remember going to that competition, not being able to even straighten my knee out properly, and competing on 4 apparatus. Actually, the crazy thing about that competition was I was competing on 4 apparatus, and we'd started on pommel horse. I'd done a good routine, but because the 4 apparatus I was doing, you wear longs, which are like the trousers in gymnastics. You couldn't see that my knee wasn't straight, but I genuinely couldn't straighten my knee, and I was competing like this. And the thing was as well, like, it wasn't that I was being forced to compete. There's no way I would have not gone to compete. That was just in my nature. That's who I was. I would lie to the coaches and say, yeah, it's okay, I can compete. And we'd gone to the rings. So rings was really hard because I was basically landing on one leg and my left knee that couldn't bend properly. So I was taking all that weight on the right leg. And the guy that went up on the rings before me and all the boys that were there with me competing, it was called the Olympic Hopes competition in the Czech Republic. We'll remember this. There was a lad called Dave Mott, and he was brilliant. And he was doing really, really difficult gymnastics, and he was doing a triple back somersault off the rings. And he's landed on this mat, and those mats back in those days were rock solid, and you wouldn't get an extra mat on top. And he's done a triple back, and he's basically compound fractured his leg, and the bone is sticking out of his leg, and he's lying there on the ground. And the most incredible thing about this, and I'll never forget, is that he didn't cry, he didn't scream, he just sat there smiling. There's a cameraman from the Czech Republic took a picture of him, and he's got his thumbs up, and he's lying on the rings mat, and they couldn't get the ambulance there quick enough. So he's lying on the mat with his thumbs up, and someone's taking a picture of him, and I had to present and do my routine while he's on the mat. It was unbelievable. Like, some of the stories of the competitions we used to get into. And the night before that competition, I remember, because my coach Sergey and the other national coach at the time, they were both from Russia, and they would come up with, they had these kind of old school remedies. I'm sure there's a lot of truth to them. Having travelled to South America now, that local medicine, a lot of that stuff, it works. I mean, ultimately, most medicine comes from the wild, right? But they asked me to do the most ridiculous thing. The night before we finished our training session, my knee's still really painful, and they basically told me I needed to wee on a towel and wrap it round my knee. And I point blank refused, because we were staying in like a communal room, all of us in bunk beds. I was like, there's no way you're getting me to do this. I thought it was a wind up. So I refused to do it. And the next morning, they both, at breakfast, they said, did you do it? I said no. So they were dead annoyed at me that I hadn't tried it. I was like, there's no way. I'll get bullied about this for the rest of my gymnastics career if I do this. There's no way I'm doing it. But we finished the competition. I did really well. We won the gold medal. We beat China, the first time a British team had ever beaten China at this junior competition. But that started a theme of me competing injured. And once I'd done it once, the problem was I knew I could do it again then. And the next year we had a competition where we competed in Australia. And in Australia, I had gone into that competition. I had a broken metatarsal in my foot. So I'd done the David Beckham injury before the World Cup, or the Wayne Rooney injury, and I was in a boot. And we fly out to Australia. It was an incredible opportunity for me. We're competing at the Australian Youth Olympic Festival. Me and Max Whitlock, Reece Betford and Ashley Watson were both super excited. We're going to Australia, the other side of the world. We're all 15. We're going on a lads trip. It's going to be incredible. And I'm going out there in a boot. And because back then we didn't have the physios and the rehab and all of that kind of stuff, I had a lot of muscle wastage in my legs. So when I took it off, you know, I hadn't used my leg for weeks, so it wasn't strong. And I remember the coaches trying to get me to get an all-around score. So I can remember like limping and hobbling down the vault run-up, trying to do a vault, which was ridiculous now. It must have looked completely bonkers from the outside. And that was the first ever competition we had where we had a physio. So the physio had just been appointed after the Beijing Olympic Games, and his first trip, starting in 2009 this was to come with us to Australia, and his first experience of gymnastics, never working in gymnastics before, was this lad with a broken metatarsal hobbling down the vault run-up, trying to do a vault to get an all-around score. So that must have been a real eye-opener for him, and working in the world of gymnastics, and how it must have been very different to where he'd come from before, because he'd been at rugby, I think, before. Because just in those days, it just wasn't very professional, you know. We were at the early stages of really competing on the world stage. And that continued throughout my teenage years, and you know, the European Championships in 2010 was one of my biggest events as a junior gymnast. And by this point, when I was 17, you know, my Osgood slatters in my knees had gone away. I'd grown out of that, and I had a wrist injury. And at the time, the Europeans was going to be the biggest competition there was for a junior athlete. It was the biggest competition, and we went into that competition. It was a crazy competition anyway, because it was when there was a volcano in Iceland. So the Russian and Ukrainian teams couldn't fly over for the Europeans. So the whole thing was a bit mad, that competition. But for me, it was going to be a qualifier for the Youth Olympic Games, the first ever Youth Olympic Games. And essentially, I was going to have to come first out of all the GB lads to qualify a spot for that Games. But I had a really bad wrist going into it. Essentially I had a stress fracture in my wrist, and I could barely do the pommel horse. And I actually remember one day we turned up, and this was about 2 weeks before the competition, and essentially this was a year after that first physio had joined, and now we had a proper team of physios and a medical team. And one morning we were at Lilleshall, everyone sat around the floor, juniors and seniors. It's like a big circle of us, because we all used to warm up in a big circle. It was brilliant. It was great, a great way to start a session, just all of us chatting, and there was loads of banter flying around, but all the physios had come in, and I'm struggling to try and compete at this time. And you had all the medical team and all the coaches having a big face-off, and we're sat in this circle, and they're arguing about whether I should compete at the Europeans or not. And all the coaches are saying, you've got to let him compete. It's the biggest competition he'll do as a junior. Potentially it's going to be qualifying him for the Youth Olympic Games. And you've got all the medical staff saying, no way, like, he could end up having a serious injury that stops him competing for the rest of his career. And I can remember walking around the corner, and a coach that wasn't my coach actually leaned over to me and said, Sam, you don't have to listen to them. This is your choice. Which, looking back now, in hindsight, like, I'm so glad I competed in that competition, and I won the European Championships. I was the all-around champion 2 weeks after that conversation, and I was struggling to do any pommel horse. And I then went to the Youth Olympic Games, and I became the Youth Olympic champion. So I would never change that. But I think that attitude back then of, you know, don't go and see a physio, you know, don't go and see a psychologist. They're going to stop you training, stop you competing. It's taken a long time to break that. And I do think that's changed now, like, in the system, but back then it really was a thing. And it's difficult for me looking back to think, you know, who had my best interests at heart then, and what was the right answer? But I chose to compete. It was my decision ultimately. I could have said, no, I'm not going to compete, but I was never going to do that. And I went on, like I said, to have loads of success, and we won again as a team. We won a second in a row team European Championships, and that was two years out from the London 2012 Olympic Games. So if I hadn't gone to those competitions, chances are I might have missed that. That would have definitely changed my trajectory, and I might have missed out on going to London 2012. But getting through that was a difficult one, and even now you can probably see it on the camera. You can look at my wrist. My wrist still sticks out now because it never really healed properly. I never let it heal properly. But I then made a transition into senior gymnastics, and that's a whole completely different kettle of fish. So at 17, actually, I made my senior debut, and I was pushed into the senior team. And senior gymnastics is very different. In junior gymnastics, you just do 8 skills in a routine, and there are some skills that are banned. So you're not allowed to do on parallel bars. You can't land in upper arms in that position. You can't do that as a junior. You weren't at the time allowed to do rollout skills. So rollout skills are now banned across the whole of gymnastics, but at the time, as a senior, we're still allowed to do those rollout skills. So they're those skills you'll see that it's a bit like a diver. So you do a somersault and dive out of it. You weren't allowed to do that skill. So there were different skills that were banned for juniors that they were allowed for seniors. So I jumped straight from doing 8 skills up to 10 skills in gymnastics, and now being able to do these skills that were banned, and especially on parallel bars, because I had really good spatial awareness. As I went into my first year of competing as a senior, that summer I really tried to push the difficulty. Now the problem was my body hadn't quite caught up with that, and I still had a junior gymnast body. My chest wasn't developed. I wasn't big and strong in my upper body, so I was doing all of these upper arm skills and I just wasn't physically prepared. And very soon I went out to Japan to compete in the Japan Cup. I did a routine with 5 skills that started or finished in upper arms, and I developed a stress fracture in my collarbone. Now, again, I'd been used to now competing injured, so this was nothing new to me, but this was a very serious injury, and I was in a lot of pain. So I spoke about it in one of the earlier episodes, but I was struggling to chalk my hands up, wear a seatbelt, and at the time, the only way for me to train was to basically take painkillers at the time, and that was a period in my life where I was probably taking strong painkillers for about 8 or 9 months, which looking back now, I was only 18. You know, that's crazy looking back now, but it wasn't rare, and it wasn't I wasn't an isolated case. The whole of our squad were doing that. And in fact, we almost had a bit of a black market situation going on where we would often get our family members to get us prescriptions. And we would, in a morning before a big training session or routines, you'd find people passing around these strong painkillers, which is crazy looking back because we were just kids. But we didn't understand, we didn't know what the potential risks of taking those painkillers or what they might do. So for us, like, with the attitude was, you kind of compete and train at all costs, and you don't go to see the physios or the doctors or a sports psychologist because they're going to stop your training. So that was just the way it was then. It was the culture, you know. That's definitely changed now. But back then, that was our reality. So going into that competition, I got through it. The damage was really serious, and afterwards I had to take a long period out. And coming back into that 2012 time, you know, I was racing against the clock. I got back as fast as I could. But as we went into my second Olympic cycle, so 2013, and the preparation was then all geared up towards Rio, a pattern started to develop. And this pattern was that I would always compete really well in the first half of the year. So I'd have a rest over Christmas. A little bit, I say a rest, I'd have a little bit of time off over Christmas. We're talking a few days with my family. I'd kind of hit the ground running at the start of the year. But by the summer, I was burnt out already. I was completely spent. And I think during my career, that's why I never really got the chance to compete at a World Championships healthily. You know, I competed at the European Championships 7 or 8 times, but I only ever went to 2 World Championships. And that was normally because by the time the World Championships rolled around in the autumn, I was so worn out and completely shattered from the year I'd had and how much training I was doing and the load I was putting on myself. And I never used to take a break or go on a holiday. I was just burnt out, and I would pick up injuries in that second half of the year. Now, the big injury that I suffered in 2014 when I was 21 was my ankle injury, you know, when I completely ruptured all of the ligaments in my left ankle. And I think at that point, that's when things started to shift a little bit, and getting injured started to have a real negative impact on my mental health, but also my outlook on my gymnastics and on myself. And I can remember that's probably when I started to, because my identity was tied into me being a gymnast and me being able to perform and me having the opportunity to win medals and potentially one day go to the Olympic Games and win a gold medal. Whenever I was injured, I felt pretty worthless. So I remember almost thinking about that time I was injured as like void time. I just want it to go as fast as possible. So I'd wish the time away, which looking back now is crazy, you know? Like, I should have been like using that time to go and see friends and do stuff outside of the gym and focus on the things in the gym that I could, you know, conditioning, getting stronger. But for me, it was wasted time because I wasn't in the gym doing what I wanted to do, doing what I loved, and more importantly, working towards my goal. Any time after that I became injured, for me, I just wanted it to go away as quick as possible. And then once I could do gymnastics again, life was kind of it was valuable again, and I was valuable, and it was worthwhile. And following that injury in 2014, my ankle injury, when I came back, again, I made the same mistake of coming back super fast. So I always did that. I always wanted to be the guy that came back faster than the physios and the doctors said I could. You know, I always had something to prove. I never took my time and really built myself up. And instead of trying to come back as fast as I possibly could, I always say to young athletes now, when they've had an injury, make sure you come back and stay back. That's the goal. The goal is to come back, be fit and healthy, and stay fit and healthy for a long period of time. I just try and get back as fast as possible. And because I cut corners, you know, I'd normally get injured again, and there'd be knock-on injuries from a big injury. And following 2014, going into 2015, I picked up loads of injuries that year, you know. I tore my lat. I tore and snapped the plantaris, which is next to it's kind of next to your Achilles. So I actually thought I snapped my Achilles. Luckily, I didn't. So that year, again, was just written off with injuries, and they were all towards the back end of the year again. So I had worked crazy hard doing all my rehab, 8 hours a day to go to the European Championships at the start of that year. And by the summer and the autumn time, I missed the World Championships again because I was burnt out, and I was picking up all these injuries. Now, going into 2016, again, I had a Christmas time where I could have a bit of a rest, and, you know, I did start to make some adjustments and take my time, and I had a brilliant 2016. But the stress of trying to make an Olympic Games on your body, your physical health and your mental health is huge. And by the end of that year in 2016, you know, I'd gone through the experience of essentially trying to appeal the decision to not select me for the Olympic Games. And I had a phone call at the end of 2016 once I decided that, you know, I was going to commit to another Olympic cycle. I wanted to be part of the program, and I was told by the national coaches I was going to be a big part of their plans and a big part of the 2020 Olympic cycle. You know, I was coming into my prime. I was 23 years of age at the time, and I had a phone call in the December, and it was one of the national coaches, and they said, we'd like to select you to compete in the American Cup in February. Now, at this point, I just tore my bicep, but I didn't tell them that. And he gave me this opportunity, and I thought, I've got to take this, you know, I might not get another chance, which is crazy now looking back, because I remember having a conversation with one of the girls in our gym, Olympian, super successful gymnast, and she just retired, and I had a conversation with her last year, and I said, you know, when I was your age, when I was 23, if someone had come and told me that 23 is really young, and that I should really take my time and think about the whole Olympic cycle, and that end target is going to the Olympics. So there's no need to rush at the beginning of that cycle. It would have made a big, big difference for me, because when I was 23, I thought, this is it. This is my peak. This is my prime. That European Championships that was going to be the next year, when I was going to be 24, that's my opportunity to be an all-rounder, compete there and get things back on track. But I had a torn bicep, and I just said yes to a competition that there was no way I was going to struggle to get fit for in less than 2 months. It was crazy, you know. I should have just said no and been brave. That would have been the brave thing to do, you know. The brave thing would have been to say, no, I'm not going to be ready. I've not got enough time. I've torn my bicep. I'll get ready, take my time, and in the summer, you know, I'll work towards that World Championships at the end of the year. And yeah, you know, I said yes. I scrambled to try and get myself fit. Didn't perform very well in that competition at all, which didn't help my cause then. And at this point, I'd become known as the guy that's always injured. So I'd gone into this competition with my torn bicep, was struggling to do rings, hadn't had a good competition. I ended up missing out on the European Championships and having the opportunity to compete as an all-rounder. So I went there to compete on high bar. Again, didn't have a great event. But my training was going really well at the start of that cycle, and I definitely was kind of one of the top guys, certainly difficulty-wise, at that time. So I went back to the drawing board over the summer, and the goal really was to make that World Championship team and go and compete as an all-arounder, because there was a lot. I think Max was taking a break that year. But again, you know, I didn't learn from my mistakes, and I was in the gym one day, and I was doing a new dismount on parallel bars, so I was doing a double front somersault with a half turn. And I did one, it was not too bad. I decided to go back to doing just a double front without the half turn. And I did it so well, and it was so high that I opened out. And when you land forwards in gymnastics, so if you do a forwards, it's a blind landing. You can't see the floor. You don't spot the floor. So you have to feel where it is. And I didn't think I was quite as high as I was. And I opened out and I landed on a straight leg. And I felt my leg bend backwards, essentially bow backwards. And it kind of went in slow motion. I could feel my knee bend like that. And it kind of just bounced back and I jumped straight onto my back and grabbed my knee like this. And I thought, that's it, I've snapped my ACL. And that was my worst nightmare in gymnastics, was my ACL or my Achilles. I hated it. I could never, it was the one thing that would make me squeamish. I could never watch it. And when my friends had those injuries, it was awful. So I wanted to avoid those two injuries at all costs. And I was lying on my back and I was going, no. And I was crying and I was thinking I've done my knee. And somebody came over, they checked my ligaments and it seemed okay. And I got an MRI scan straight away. Again, that became a common theme. You know, I would ring up the BG physios, particularly in that Tokyo cycle. I'd ring them up and say, hey, Johnny, I've got an injury. Can you get me an MRI scan? And I'd get sent out to get a scan the next day. And it came back and I'd tore my hamstring. And the one positive that came out of that was that when I had been in rehab for my ankle injury, I got really close with the medical team. And I was really inquisitive. And I would ask them a lot of questions. So I'd ask the strength and conditioning coach, you know. I can remember one day we sat there and there was a young gymnast called Johnny. Incredible gymnast. He was incredible on floor and vault. And we used to have to do, it was basically, we'd have to do like marker training at the beginning of the year where we'd have to do certain exercise and it was to measure where we were physically before we started the year. And there was one exercise where you had to do a leg press, and you had to do a leg press with, I think it was 3/4 of your body weight, and you had to go to maximum. So you had to do as many reps as possible. And I can remember it was early 2016, I think, and Johnny had been doing this exercise and he was like the best young talent in the world on floor and vault. And he could only do a handful of reps. And maxing out, I think, was 35 reps. And I can remember hearing people joke saying, well, it doesn't matter, Johnny's the best on floor and vault. He doesn't need to do leg press. And I had a conversation with the strength and conditioning coach and I asked him, you know, why are we doing this? Why is this important? And he said, well, Sam, like, what you need to know is that it's really important that your hamstring is equally as strong as your quad. That's what prevents knee injuries. I was like, wow, that's fascinating. No one's ever told me that before, because in gymnastics, we never do hamstring training ever. A lot of the physios, we didn't have a physio set up back in the day, so the coaches were never educated on how the body works and how you need to essentially train your body to prevent injury. So that was fascinating. I'd learned that and I'd taken that on board. So I incorporated hamstring training into my training, and that's what saved me. My hamstring basically held on for dear life when I bent my knee backwards, and that's what saved me from snapping my ACL. Now, going into the rest of that cycle, same thing kind of happened. 2018, I went into the British Championships. And at this point, I was getting towards the end of my career. And I was in this vicious cycle of getting injured, trying to get back, getting injured, trying to get back. And every time I tried to get back, I was having to almost take more and more risks because I was further and further behind all of the guys now that were competing consistently and being at the top. So I was having to go harder every single time and take more risks and try and hit almost like a Hail Mary. And we went to the British Championships. I was trying to do a new vault with the idea that one day I might be able to do a handspring with a 2.5 twist on vault. So I'd started learning a handspring 1.5 twist that year, and it'd been going fine, to be fair. But we get to the competition, I'm very inexperienced in doing this vault. It was the first time competing it. And in some ways I was probably a little bit naive, and I took that vault for granted. I thought it's just a 1.5 twist, it'll be fine. We got to the vault and I started on floor. Hadn't done a great routine, and before we did the vaults, Sergey said to me, Sam, maybe we'll just do a Souk double twist. And I said, no, I'm going to do the 2 vaults. I'm going to do a handspring 1.5 and a Souk. I'll be fine. Because I'd learned from, 2014, before I did my vault at the Commonwealth Games, that I have to be in the right mindset. I can't be 50-50. And I genuinely thought I'd be fine. So I'm running through this vault and I do this handspring. I block off the vault. I do this 1.5 twist. And in my head, I think I'm landing fine. It feels like the ones I do in the gym. It's normal. But I basically get no rotation. I land almost flat on my stomach on both of my ankles. It bends my ankle back, my left one, where I've had my surgery. And essentially my left ankle, it only has a limited amount of range. You can't push it any further. And I'd forced it further than where it can go. And I have so much scar tissue there that if I yank it like that, it is excruciatingly painful. And I can remember lying there, putting my hand up. They had to come on with gas and air. My mum, my dad, my family are in the crowd, and they take me off, and I thought I'd snapped my Achilles. So the second time I thought I'd done the injury I didn't want to do, and I'm in agony in this essentially emergency room at the arena. I've been stretchered off in front of 7,000 people. My mum and dad come down. My mum's just had to watch that again. And, you know, this is like a repeat. It's something that's happened before. She's watched me at the Commonwealth Games like this, so she's really upset. And I'm getting the physio. I'm asking the physios, check my Achilles, please check my Achilles. And they're feeling my Achilles to see if it's there. And they're saying, we think it's okay. I think it's all right. And I'm like, there's no way I've not done anything serious. I go off to the hospital. I have x-rays and scans. And incredibly, it just turns out that I've badly bruised that ankle and essentially just stretched it further than it can go. And I was going to just need to stay off it for about 6 to 8 weeks. Now, I'd started to learn some lessons at this point. And what I would do before was, every time I'd get injured, because I told you about that time that I felt was void and I'd just want to wish it away, I'd think, well, I'm injured now. And I was always a professional, and I would take gymnastics and my training and my diet so seriously. I'd never relax and go out, and I would never drink. The only time I would do that was either straight after a competition, when I was depressed, or when I was injured. So my response to being injured was, well, I've not got to train and compete now, so I can go out with my friends at the weekend. And I'd kind of just wish the week away, get to the weekend, go out with my friends and do that. And that would help me pass the time, basically, until I was back doing gymnastics. And then I'd stop, I'd be straight back to gymnastics again, the ultimate professional. But I'd figured out, and no one explained this to me when I was younger, which is funny looking back, because if somebody would, it would have made a huge difference. But I didn't know that alcohol and going out and drinking and not getting the right amount of sleep massively impacts the speed in which you recover. And I'd learned it at this point. I'd been told about it. So it was honestly the first time. In 2018, what's that? That's like 5 years ago. So I was 25. It's the first time I'd got injured and then said, right, for these next 6 weeks, I'm going to really look after myself. I'm going to eat properly, sleep properly. I'm not going to drink any alcohol. And it made a big difference, and I came back really fast that year. And going into 2019, I'd been under a lot of pressure. So I knew that I was potentially going to be taken off the GB squad in April 2019. So again, I was in an even more extreme situation where I was now going to have to score an incredibly high score to qualify myself back onto the GB squad. Otherwise, that was it. I was going to be taken off. You know, I'd been on that squad since I was 8 years old. I was going to lose all my funding. I didn't have any sponsorships at that time, so I wasn't going to earn any money. So I did everything I possibly could, and ultimately, you know, I had a terrible competition. I went into the competition. I remember putting my hand up on the high bar, and at that time I'd basically been looking for a silver bullet, something that I couldn't understand why I couldn't put it together anymore. I didn't get it. You know, I was doing everything I used to do when I was younger, but it just wasn't working for me. So, you know, I'd listen to podcasts and listen to different people talk, and I'd try and find these little things. I was looking for a silver bullet that would solve all of my issues and get me back on track to how, you know, the success I had when I was younger. And I'd heard about intermittent fasting at this point. I thought, that sounds good. And I listened to all these UFC fighters talking about it. I thought, that's a great idea, you know, that might be the thing that's missing. So I'd started really restricting my eating at the beginning of 2019. And going into that competition at the British Championships, I put my hand up for the first routine on the high bar. I started the routine and I just had nothing in me. And I realised in that moment, oh no, I've made a big mistake here. You know, I was very light. I must have been competing at about 63 kilos. And my natural weight was about 67, I think, by the end of my career. So I was super light. And obviously when you're not eating properly, you're not recovering properly, you're not sleeping properly, it massively affects your mental health. I didn't know it at the time. It hadn't been diagnosed, but I was suffering with depression, anxiety. And so my body was just falling to pieces. I got taken off the British squad, and going into that summer, you know, my goal was still this Olympic Games next year, but it's becoming more and more unlikely. And I started to really, really suffer with pain in my neck. So earlier that year, I'd been filming with Sam one day, and I'd trapped a nerve in my neck very early in the year, start of 2019, and we actually got it on camera. And I couldn't move my neck. And this used to happen to me like a couple of times a year, either in my back or my neck. I get a spasm. It lasts for a couple of days and then it'd be fine. But this time it lingered for a long time. And I'd gone to a training camp with this neck injury. And this was at the start of that year in 2019. So that had massively inhibited my training. But it eventually kind of went away. But start of the summer 2008, it was coming back. I was getting that pain. And it got to the point where one day I was in the gym and my neck completely went. I was just warming up. All I was doing was warming up. My neck went and I couldn't move it, to the point where even moving my eyes from left to right was hurting my neck. And I tried to drive home and I couldn't move my head. I just had to leave my car, get someone else to pick me up. And I had gone in to see the physio and a doctor that had known me for about 10 years, and I'd basically gone in with this neck pain. And they said, we're going to send you for some MRI scans. And what actually came out of that doctor's meeting was that I got sent for essentially, they asked that if I would fill out a profiling, and it was about mental health. And I can remember walking out of that room just before I left when I'd gone about my neck, and I said, look, Kate, you know, if I'm really stressed, could this be affecting my neck? And she said, yes. A lot of people, stress affects people in many different ways. And for a lot of people, they take it in their neck. And that's certainly what I do. And at the time, I was hinging like this in my neck. So basically what was happening, the discs in my neck were compressing, and it was compressing on the nerve that runs down my neck. And I was getting nerve pain all the way down my neck into my hand. So my hand would be cold all the time. And I just couldn't train. I couldn't do any gymnastics, you know. At one point, I was like, the only thing I could do in a day was go and have a sauna at David Lloyd. That was it. I just couldn't. I tried again after again. I'd go to the gym, try and do some training, try and warm up. I just couldn't move my neck. Yeah, and eventually I got the MRI scan results back. They said, you've got essentially a bulging disc. It's pressing on the nerve, compressing the nerve. You're going to have to stop training. We need to lengthen your neck, stop it hinging, and hopefully we've got it early enough and we can stop that. And it's very similar to the injury that Niall went on to have, and it ended Niall's career, essentially. So I'm really lucky that we got that early and I stopped. But after that, you know, that was really serious, and I started to think about life after gymnastics, because you don't mess around with your neck. And I think that's the first time that I kind of went, you know what, actually, it's more important here for me to get well for the rest of my life than gymnastics. The Olympic Games next year, it's going to be tough. It's going to be very unlikely I'm going to make the team now. And actually, I want to enjoy some gymnastics at the end of my career. And going into the end of that year, I'd been in therapy for 3 months at this point, after being essentially, they said, look, Sam, we can help you with your mental health as well as your physical health, and we think you'd benefit from having some therapy. So I was diagnosed with depression, anxiety, went into therapy. And it's funny, the last serious injury I had in my career in 2019 was the week I came out of therapy. So my last therapy session was on the Thursday, and I was in a really good place. Therapy for me, changed my life. And I'd come out, I was training again, I was happy, my neck had gone away. And it was like a test from God. And I'd learned all of this stuff, and we talked about how I struggled with getting injured and wishing time away during my therapy. And it was a Thursday, I had my last session. I came out, I was really happy. At the weekend, there was an Anthony Joshua fight, I think, that weekend. Man United were playing Man City, and on a Saturday morning, I went down to West Bridgford and I thought, you know what, I'm going to put a bet on United to beat Man City. I reckon they'll beat Man City. And I think they did. I think they went on to win 2-1. And we went to the gym. I was dead happy. And I was there with 2 of the lads in the gym, Pavel and Matt, and we were on the trampoline right at the end. And I've jumped off that trampoline hundreds of thousands of times since I was a little kid. It's the same trampoline I did that triple somersault off and shattered my cheekbone. And in the gym, if you go wrong in the air and you take off badly and you're going to land on the equipment, you know, in the wrong angle, or you might go off to the side, you might land on the concrete at the side of the mats, someone will give you a shout. So somebody gave me a shout because I was going to do a full twist and double back somersault. Really easy skill for me. But my knees buckled a little bit and I went forwards. I didn't go backwards and I stayed on the spot. And in the air, Pavel gave me a shout and he said, Sam, like that. Now, my brain straight away knew, okay, I must be coming back down on the mat. But I was always really good at just sneaking out of those things because I had really good spatial awareness. And I just thought I'd be okay. And I landed straight back on the bar of the trampoline. And both of my ankles bent back like this It was disgusting. I felt the skin in my ankle like fold over because it went back so far. And I did like a forward roll and I closed my eyes and squeezed my teeth and I just started shouting for Josh because Sergey wasn't in the gym that morning. And it was so painful and I felt really bad afterwards because I was swearing and I was screaming, Josh, Josh, Josh. And he ran over and I grabbed his hands like this and squeezed them as hard as I could. And again, the last time in my career, my mum got the phone call, Dawn, can you pick up Sam and take him to A&E? And my mum came and Josh and my mum helped carry me into the car and I was in agony with my ankles because, like I'd said, there was only so much range left in my ankle. The surgeon had fixed it so tight it could only go so far. So when it got to the point where it couldn't go any further, everything around it and all the scar tissue and the carbon fibre ligaments I had, it would be excruciatingly painful. And I went off to hospital and it turned out that I'd basically fractured both of my ankles. And it was hard for them to tell whether they were new fractures or old fractures because of the surgery I'd had and a lot of the older injuries I had when I was younger. And I was back in that place where I was at my granddad's house. I was living with my granddad at the time. I had 2 ankles up like that, couldn't walk, had 2 boots on, had crutches. And I sat and recovered with my granddad and I just iced my ankles all day, every day. And, this time I had a choice. Either I do the same thing I used to do or I do it differently. And this time I chose to do something different. So I'm really proud that I'd finally learned that lesson and I recovered properly, took my time. I didn't go out drinking. I spent time with friends. I focused on other stuff. At the time I was learning Japanese, so that was great for me. So I'd get lifts to Japanese classes and learn Japanese. And I just focused on my life and it gave me a bit of a view to the future of what my life would be like after gymnastics. And actually, I want to be able to play football when I finish gymnastics. If we have kids, I want to be able to throw them up in the air, And I started to, value myself and my body more. And so I made different decisions. And this time when I came back, I never really had any more serious injuries again in my gymnastics because I put my health first. I didn't take big risks. I didn't value a medal or winning a competition or getting back onto a squad or getting onto a team over my own physical health. And I'm really glad I learned that lesson in the end. And now, having retired and being retired for nearly 18 months, I now play football every morning and my ankle gives me no issues. Every Saturday morning. I go to the gym and lift weights. I was always worried I'd never be able to lift weights because I had so many issues with my shoulders. And now I'm fine and I enjoy exercise and I don't take any stupid risks and I value my body way more than I used to, and that's been really important for me. And I think if I was going to give a young athlete one piece of advice, if they're going through something at the moment and maybe they have an injury or they've had an injury in the past or they'll have an injury will come around in the future, I say the best piece of advice is to honestly just take your time. And what I said earlier, try and get back and stay back. Don't try and get back as fast as you possibly can. Don't cut any corners. The aim of a recovery and coming back from an injury is to get back and stay back, because if you had asked me when I was younger, Sam, would you rather have a really successful junior career or a really long, successful senior career? I would have taken the senior career every day of the week. And if that had been my outlook from the beginning, I would have approached certainly injuries and my gymnastics very differently. So I think that would be the best piece of advice I could give someone. That was my story. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next episode.